Hey folks, let's do something a little bit different today. Today we're going to talk about the Garretson Impco Model KN. They're calling it a low pressure regulator, but it's a demand regulator. Basically, it kind of adapts itself to your needs up to a point. And what it does is you put the propane in from a regulator here, like a barbecue pit regulator or something. You want it to be one that'll handle over 80,000 BTUs if possible. They use these on generators a lot. It really depends on the engine you're using, but if it's much of an engine at all, it needs to be a fairly sizable regulator. Camper regulators, if you can lay hands on one, are great for this. They all put out the same amount of pressure on the other end. It's a little under 1 psi. This one actually says max inlet 8 ounces. That's kind of a lie. That's not entirely correct. But this one's a Chinese knockoff. So here's what we got. The propane comes in this side, and it comes out this side. You mount this vertically because if it's laying down one way or the other, there's a gigantic diaphragm in here. We're going to get into that in a minute. And that gigantic diaphragm senses when vacuum is applied here. So your tube for your propane needs to be in a place where it's going to sense some vacuum. Therein lies the rub, because it is always different unless, every single company did it the same way, or if every person who's doing this on their own, making their own homespun contraption, did it the same way, you could get by with a lot less adjustment. But this piece of junk here came from China. Now, ordinarily, I am the first person to get on board with a Chinese item. They're generally cheaper and they're generally identical. And to be fair, this one was too. But there's some moron working in the factories over there that clearly has no sense at all or doesn't understand what this is for. And they put this cover cap in. Now, right here is your adjustment. You screw that in, harder to get propane out. If you're getting too much propane, screwing this in will solve it. If you've got a little bitty engine that can't develop enough oomph to suck the little butterfly open in here from the vacuum, or if your application is in such a place where it's not getting enough vacuum, you should probably change your application. But if you can't, if that's the way it is, or if it's a factory carburetor, you screw this out just a little bit. It only takes a dab, but and a little adjustment goes a long way. That's why it's imperative for this cap to be accessible here. That's this piece. It just goes in there and it locks it in place. Once you've made your final adjustment, you screw this cap in and it sticks there, and that's that. Well, these idiots that built this one, look how chewed this up. Look how chewed this up. Look how chewed up this is. I don't know if the camera does it justice, but this thing was epoxied in place. Now, what kind of idiot epoxies the adjustment when it's a device designed to be adjustable so that it can meet a wide variety of applications? That is mentally deficient. There's a reason they did that, and I can't fathom what it would be, but it is not to help the consumer in any way, because it renders this thing basically useless. And when I say that, remember, let's say they made this for a 15 horsepower motor, and they adjusted it for a 15 horsepower motor, and they epoxied this cap in place. How is that 15 horsepower motor set up? How is the tube set up? Is this a factory carburetor? Is this somebody's airbox intervention set up with a tube just jammed in it? Because there's about 1,000 ways you can put propane on something to make it run. How do they know that? How do they know what this was going on? They don't. And gluing this cap down, that's idiotic. There's no reason for that. Well, basically, I've virtually destroyed this one. I'm going to try to fix it. Not in this video, but we're going to take this apart, and I'm going to show you how this works, how simple this is. This was a work of genius. Now, the reason I bought a Chinese one, and I'm going to buy another Chinese one if I can find one without the cap glued in there, is because these things are so expensive for what they are. When you see what's in it, you'll understand what I'm talking about. This is made out of aluminum, and it's not the most durable of aluminum, but it's not meant to be something that takes a beating. It's got a little button here. This is the prime button that defeats this big diaphragm. So what you do is when you put this on, there's a little butterfly in here. It serves two purposes. It doesn't just regulate the amount of propane based on the demand of the application, it also serves as a fuel shutoff, which means if there is no vacuum on this end, there's a little flapper in there that slaps shut and just stops the fuel from coming through. That flapper does all the work. There's 3 pieces to this thing, or 4. You got 2 covers. You've got that flapper and a big diaphragm. That's basically everything that's doing work. All this other junk you bolt on. But basically, that's all there is to it. And of course, this adjuster changes how hard that little flapper is to move. When your engine draws vacuum and it opens this too much, it lets too much propane through. You screw that screw in a little bit, and that balances that out. But as your engine demands more, it sucks it a little bit more open and sucks a little bit more propane through. But it also serves as a fuel shutoff. And that's why it's imperative for this thing to be working right, because if you actually expect this thing to stop the fuel for 10 minutes, say you shut the engine off, run over to play with your deer stand or whatever, come back, or if it's on a generator and you need to change tanks, well, you've turned off the gas, so it doesn't matter. But if you turn it off for a minute to, fill it up and, well, no, you're back to changing tanks. We're back with propane. Well, there would be reasons that you would turn this off and not shut off the fuel for a few minutes. And that shutoff is intended to stop the fuel, at least temporarily. Now, I wouldn't leave a tank turned on and hooked up to it forever, but briefly, so you don't flood your engine with propane. That is the point of this, is it shuts the fuel off when there is no demand, no vacuum on the end here that goes to the engine. Well, let's get this thing apart. So another stupid thing is this thing came with those safety Torx bits in it, the ones with the little nib on the inside here that keeps you from putting your Torx in. Well, I promptly popped those out when I realized that this thing was FUBAR. But anyway, we get the screws out of this, and there's not just too much to this, I'll tell you. When you see the inside, you'll understand why I don't buy the name brand ones. You get this straight from the company, bring your wallet, it's like $100. And there ain't $100 here. There just ain't. I don't care how good it is or how convenient it is, it can be made a lot cheaper. And there's no reason to pay $100 for this. There isn't $5 worth of parts in it. And most of it's cast. This has all been poured and cast. So it's not like there's a whole bunch of delicate machinery here. They got to thread a couple of pieces. And I bet you anything, there's very little human involvement. It's a machine. There's guys standing there pushing a button and it goes through 3 operations. It moves on to the next thing. And if there's even that much, if it's not completely automated, because when you see how simple it is, you'll understand how completely automated this could be. Assembly, putting it together, would take a person a minute. A person working in a factory who's done this, 1,000 times a day can put this thing together in about a minute, I'd say. There's really nothing to it. I've almost got all the screws out here. I'm going to show you what's inside so that you understand what it does, because it's important when you put something on this. It can't just be a mystery black box. I put it on and it worked. It's best to know how a thing works, because understanding how a thing works lets you understand what you're doing when you're changing the adjustment, or in this case, when you're melting the internals, because they've epoxied it and you think a little bit of torch will probably be okay, but it turns out a little bit of torch ain't. If I had this to do over again, or if you end up with one of these with an epoxied in cover cap there so you can't adjust it, my recommendation is to very carefully take this apart so you don't damage the diaphragm, which is what we're doing right now. Now this plate will lift off here, this cover plate, and there's a diaphragm inside, and it's attached to a little needle. It's down behind here. There's a little needle, kind of like you'd see in a carburetor. And I got to go the right way. It should be up, I think. Am I still stuck somewhere? No? Okay. Now, this is turned. Let me turn this right and see. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so here's your diaphragm. It is enormous, and it gives it huge mechanical advantage. So a little change in vacuum goes a long way. And that's why that adjustment is imperative. Because this little flapper right here, see how it's not, you move it and it just, well, what happened here is I got this hot, and I believe this snaps on. I don't believe it was in a through hole. You'll see what I mean in a second. And here's your little needle thing. It's not really a needle. It's not really needling anything, but it hooks on very much like the float in a carburetor with this little forked end here. Now, it's important when you put these together, if you ever overhaul one, there's a little fork here, and that jumps over this little nail head looking thing. And it captures it and stays in there. If you end up putting this on top of that, it ain't going to work. But look how slow that moves. That's because that's been melted. We're going to need a Phillips for this part. Now, here's the little flapper. And like I said, there's a little spring in there that closes that flapper. Let me loosen this just a little. Now it moves fast. Now it isn't slow. Well, what happened? And I tried putting a little lithium grease on it, and I didn't. I'm going to have to ream that hole out just a little bit. Well, it got hot enough and it should have, based on what I was doing, because I didn't know what was inside this for sure. I had an idea, but I wasn't 100% sure because I never had one apart. I knew how it worked, and that was all I really needed to know, but I'd never really gotten a good look at the internals. Now, the American-made ones or whatever, the Garretsons, the name brand ones, very well might have metal parts in them. I don't know. But this piece is plastic in this one, and you shouldn't be heating up something that goes into propane anyway, but it was useless. I mean, the thing, without being adjustable, with that cap in there, and I chewed that cap to the point that a screwdriver wouldn't hardly turn it anymore, and it still wasn't budging, didn't even twitch. All right, here's a little flapper, and here's your spring. Now, that adjuster, when you change that adjuster, it changes the tension on this spring, which is pushing right here. It goes right here. And this little flap seals against this hole. And so the more pressure there is, the harder it is for that diaphragm to open that. And it only opens it so much based on demand. The more vacuum is applied to this, the more it opens that hole, the more propane it allows to flow. So this is like a variable orifice almost. Well, anyway, this little pin here, I don't know if it snaps on, if this just snapped in, because it kind of looks that way. But this pin is supposed to be free floating. It's supposed to move easy. And you really got to bear down to get this pin to budge, because I got it so freaking hot trying to get that epoxy loose. Well, anyway, that is really all there is to it. It's how it works. They sell rebuild kits for these. Good luck finding them. I looked around a little bit, seeing if I could find just this piece, or even this piece and a diaphragm I don't need, if it was cheap enough. Because I only paid, here's the listing for it. I only paid, it says 48 something, but there was shipping or something. It ended up being like $52 from Parts eBuy. Well, I don't know who Parts eBuy is, and I've probably bought other stuff from them and never had a problem. I don't know. But do not buy this one, because this one, with that epoxied in cap, you basically have a paperweight. It is useless if you can't adjust it, because every application will be different. But that's how it works. It's a really simple thing. And if your engine is running rich, if it's sucking too much fuel, you tighten the screw in righty-tighty, just a tiny bit at a time. It's best if you can get the engine running. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you got to turn it a little, just a twitch, and try to start it, and turn it a little, just a twitch, and try to start it, because it'll be getting so much or so little propane that you just can't get a sustained blast out of it and get it running. But if you can get it started, it's best to adjust that with it running. And if you can't tell if it's a little too rich or a little too lean, just barely turn it. And you should notice, if it's running pretty rough, you should notice a distinct difference. It'll quickly come around to the way you want it to run. But I'm going to work on this one, I think. I'm going to see if I can fix it. I've got another regulator that's off of It's off of a Predator 212, and it was a Chinese carburetor with a little regulator like this, but much smaller, made just for that engine. But it's adjustable enough. It's got an adjustable orifice, which means the pipe coming out of here, there's an adjustment, like a set screw that kind of partially blocks the hole. You can in and out with a little bit. It actually reduces the amount of vacuum this sees and reduces the amount of propane that goes through. yeah, it's not the best way. This is the best way if you can adjust it. If you can't, this thing is not worth buying at all. So keep that in mind. If you order one and you can't tell, and you get it and you look in there and you see some kind of clear glue holding this in, take a screwdriver and very gently, without stripping it, try to unscrew that. If it ain't coming out, send that sucker right back because it's junk. If you can't adjust it, that was the whole point of this thing. If you can't rig it to fit your application, even if your application is the one this thing was set up and designed for, that doesn't mean it's going to work, because every engine is different to some extent. If you can't fine tune it, if you can't adjust it at all, there is no plug and play with these things. They all have to have some minor form of adjustment. They have to. This one doesn't, because it was glued in place. And if I'd have took it apart, if I'd taken it apart and taken this piece out and the diaphragm wasn't hurt, but if I could take the diaphragm out and everything, then you can heat that up enough to get that epoxy to melt. And you better have a good screwdriver. And if it don't budge when you give it a little, don't give it a lot. Just go ahead and start heating it, because that's all you can do. It's the only way you're going to get that loose. Then you got to try and clean those threads. I cleaned these with a wire wheel on my grinder, but I can't get a wire wheel inside of there. So I cleaned these real good, and then I was in and out, in and out, in and out, smoothing them up so that you could actually get this cap to go down there and lock tight against the back side of this adjustment here where the screwdriver slide is. It looks just like this before you destroy it. I pretty well destroyed that one, but it'd still screw in and lock. But with this piece here melted and screwed up, because that's what you have to do, you've got to heat it up. Then what? Then you got junk. So, all right, guys, that's my warning for today. That is how this thing works. I hope you found this informational. If you did like the video, well, like, subscribe, comment below if you've got any ideas on this. It was my own fault, I guess, for heating it up without taking it apart first, but I didn't think I was heating it that much. That's how I screwed this up. And if you get one and you are knowledgeable enough and confident enough to take this apart and put it back together, knowing full well it regulates propane and might blow you right to kingdom come if you put it back together wrong, that is how you take it apart. And you have to heat it right around the edge here to get that epoxy hot enough to turn it into a liquid. Whatever glue it is, it's clear and it's sticky. It's some good stuff. But anyhow, like and subscribe if you would. Comment below if you like. Let me know if you've had one of these, because I'm telling you right now, these ones with the glued in things, I'm sure if you had one, you've got a story to tell. Hey, thanks for watching, guys. We'll catch you next time.